my screen.
So they can.
Start. Hi, everyone. Sorry, we're just getting up and running. We've got a new webinar producer who's just trying to get up to speed. You'll be muted during this webinar, and we're going to get started in another minute or so. It's 9 a.m. now, so let's give it 2 minutes and we'll get started. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Can I just confirm that you're hearing us okay and seeing us okay? If anyone used the chat feature, bottom left corner, I believe, and let us know that everything is okay so we can get started. Okay, looks good, everyone. I'm getting your feedback. I'm good. We can hear you well. It's okay. Great. So let's get started. This is the second in the series of TASCA webinars and called Measuring Subnational Level Emissions. If you could just switch the slide. This webinar is being co-organized by, well, first of all, just these are some directions on how to use the webinar. I think looks like most of you are coming in via the app and the mic and speakers audio option. Just a reminder, you'll be in listen only mode, and feel free to raise any questions in the questions panel during the webinar. If there are quick kind of clarification questions, we'll be monitoring them and ask Fawn to address them during his presentation, but otherwise we'll be reserving the last half an hour at least for questions and answers. So start queuing up your comments and questions. And this webinar will be recorded and available within probably an hour after this. Feel free to send it to other people that you think might be interested. All they need to do is register, and then they'll be able to listen to the recording from the link that I'll be sending you. So as I mentioned, this webinar is being organized by a WRI initiative called Tracking and Strengthening Climate Action, or TASCA. We are working in 5 countries in particular, Colombia, Ethiopia, India, Indonesia, and South Africa, to work with governments for the tools and resources they need to track progress in their NDCs. Also co-organizer is, you can change the slide, is the Partnership on Transparency in the Paris Agreement, known as PATPA. It was launched in 2010, and it's kind of organized or sponsored by South Africa, Korea, and Germany, again, working on transparency issues in the Paris Agreement. I'm going to introduce you now to Dr. Wee Keen Fong. Fong is the from WRI China and global lead on subnational climate strategy. Fong, thanks for being here today, and please introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm Fong, so everybody calls me Fong. So I'm, as shown on the screen, so I'm leading the subnational climate works at World Resources Institute. Actually, I do have another colleague here, Alex Kovac, also on the line, who is another expert we have on subnational climate work. So maybe Alex, you want to quickly introduce yourself or say hello to everyone?
Hi, everyone. My name is Alex. I work with Fong here at WRI.
Alex is also going to be monitoring the chat room. So again, if you have a question, like a clarifying question, just do right hand or write your quick question and he'll let us know. Otherwise, we'll talk at the end.
Yep. Okay.
And also, I already see a question. Can you confirm if the NDC rulebook is now agreed? I guess not. We can say that you know they're in the final stretch of negotiating the implementation guidelines of the Paris Agreement that should be finalized by COP24. So you could probably say a lot more about that, Fong.
Yeah, sure. So I think how we're going to organize this webinar is that we have about 55 minutes more. So I will be the main person walking through the slides. So I have about 20 slides, so it wouldn't take too much time. So walk through and as you have been doing, so if you have any questions, just type out your questions, and if there is any quick clarification question, then we'll address you. Otherwise, we'll discuss after my presentation. It will take maybe like 15-20 minutes. Alex, also feel free to chime in if you have anything to add. So as shown on the screen, so we have a couple small sections for. So I'll start with today's our title is measuring subnational level emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. So there are 4 topics I would like to address. So one is basically why we're doing this and why it is important to measure subnational level greenhouse gas emissions. Then followed by what should we consider when doing it so. Then we'll talk more about how. So this would be the 4 topics I'm going to cover today. So let's start with the first one is why measuring subnational level greenhouse gas emissions. So as shown on the screen, so you can see, so what I think the main point is that subnational jurisdictions, whether they are states or provinces, cities or communities, so in a lot of cases, they are the main sources of greenhouse gas emissions because of the activities they have, like transport, buildings, and so on. So they produce emissions. But at the same time, they're also the innovators. So there are a lot of solutions coming from cities, from states. So it's really a very important stakeholder in addressing climate change. So that's why we think it's important to start with measuring the emissions. So that if you look at the 2 small bullet points that you have, so I think the other thing I would like to highlight is that, of course, depending on the governance system of a country, so many actions in the NDCs are actually implemented at the subnational, whether in a city or in a state. And in some cases, actually, the cities, the states actually the initiator. So they initiated and plan for actions, sometimes even beyond the NDCs. So it's really important to consider the action from and the last point was cities. So as I said earlier, so they're the centers of demand for energy, for resources, as well as for human activities that produce emissions, but there also a lot of time test bed for innovation and solution. Like I think there are many cases that we can discuss later on. So then the second point we like to highlight is that besides the importance of subnational actors, we can see over the past years that more and more cities, states are already stepping up to take action. So this slide shows the cities and communities that have committed to the global COVID-19 measures for climate and energy. So to that, there are already more than 9,000 cities and communities worldwide. So you can see on the map. So even though many of them are in Europe, you can see, but actually over the past years, we have seen growing numbers of cities from developing countries. You see in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia. So more and more cities are already taking action. Then the next slide is another example we'd like to highlight. So that is in the case of the US. So with the setback of the federal government in the US, actually many states, cities, and including companies are already stepping up to take more action. So you see the graphics here, what presented last year in 2017 in an initiative called America's Pledge. So about 20 states, more than 100 cities have already committed to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And I believe today that the numbers is even higher. So so with all this, we can see it is really important to take into consideration. I mean the action taken by the subnational jurisdictions. Then this slide shows how is the relationship between subnational action and the national policy. So I think in this space, I think many of you are from the national governments or interested in the national policies or NDCs. But actually, so as I just now touched upon, so to implement the NDCs, so in many cases, actually, we need to coordinate with subnational entities, states, cities, or districts, and so on for implementation, whether they're in the form of green buildings or public transportations and so on. So it is really important to consider this subnational action. And in many cases, as I said, so they are initiated by the cities, by states, and so on. So we need to think about how to scale up these actions to the NDCs. And in some cases, also you can see, for example, in the US or in China and other countries, many pilot programs are implemented at the city level or provincial level. So we need to think through how to scale up all these pilots or these subnational actions to the to nationwide to include in the NDCs. So that was basically about why. So I think next thing is about what. That's meant. So what should we consider when we measure subnational level emissions? So I put up a few bullet points. So these are not everything, but I thought these are a couple important points we should highlight when we consider about measuring subnational greenhouse gas emissions. So I think firstly, so even though we say we're measuring emissions, but the ultimate goal is to facilitate all these actors to take action. So I think the very first objective would be how this emission data can help cities or states to plan for the action. So this would include like considering where are the key sources of emissions and where are the opportunities for emission reduction. So this would be the primary objective, I think. Then secondly, of course, it's about transparency, how to make sure the emission data is transparently presented and consistently over the years, and as well with other subnational jurisdictions. And then the third one is really about empowerment, how to empower these subnational actors to take action, and their actions are recognized whether by the national government or in the international arena. So this is the third one, and the fourth one I think is really important in this webinar is that I think many of us are concerned about NDC. So it's very important for this data, subnational data, to be able to aggregate to the national level to be considered as a part of the NDC, whether it's from the implementation perspective or from enhancement perspective. So then we need to consider about the consistency of data between subnational and national level. Then the final one, I think, is more about the needs and capacity at the subnational level. So as I highlighted, the earlier bullet points were more about the transparency and so on, but we always have to remember that capacity at the subnational level is not same as the national level. In many cases, they have less capacity, they have less data, and in some cases, they don't need to be as comprehensive as the national greenhouse gas inventory. So all this have to be considered. So basically, is to understand the local circumstances before we decide about the requirements and what to do at the subnational level. So then this third topic is about how to measure subnational level greenhouse gas emissions. So I would start this with greenhouse gas protocol. If you were in the last webinar that we had, I think maybe 2 weeks ago. So maybe you heard about this greenhouse gas protocol or GHG protocol. So it is an initiative launched in 1998, so it's exactly 20 years now. So so the objective of this initiative is to develop standards and tools, guidance to help different actors to measure and report their greenhouse gas emissions. So since we started in 1998, so as shown on the screen, so there are how many, 7 key products we have produced, as well as there are many other associating calculation tools, guidance, and so on. So covering many aspects of greenhouse gas accounting, for whether it's for product, for companies, and so on. And our focus today would be more on the right side. So we call it GPC. So it is a greenhouse gas emission accounting standard for cities and communities. So this is the one. So the full title is a Global Protocol for Community Scale Greenhouse Gas Emission Inventories, but in short, we normally call it a Greenhouse Gas Protocol for Cities, or GPC. So it was published in 2014, so it's 4 years now. So actually, accounting for city level greenhouse gas emission is not something new. It's not something that started 4 years ago. But since the 90s or 2000s, so many, I wouldn't say many, but some cities have already started practicing it. But over the past 10 years or so, the inventories have not been really standardized. So there were many different types or methodologies were used by different cities. So what we were trying to do is to standardize the requirements, the reporting, and the principles. So we started this work in 2011, and the publication was in 2014. So now many cities globally have already using it. So this is the basic content of the GPC if you're not familiar. So there are 3 parts. So basically, it sets out the requirements and provide guidance for calculating and reporting citywide or community-wide greenhouse gas emissions. But it is not a methodology. So it is a standard. So basically, it tells you what is required to calculate so and so emission sources. Then, so you may use your own model, your own methodology, as long as you comply with the principles, rules specified in the GPC. So you can see there are 3 parts in the GPC. We started with requirements on reporting. So that is part 1. Then part 2, we provide more guidance and requirements for each sector that covers, we call it stationary energy, transport, waste, IPPU, and AFOLU. So if you're familiar with all this terminology is used in the IPCC guidelines. Then the part 3, so is about setting goals and so on. So and as well as data quality control. So this is the basic content of the GPC. I wouldn't get into too much detail, but we'll cover some of them. So I'll start by saying that when you develop an inventory or greenhouse gas inventory for city or for community or district, so you would start by setting the inventory boundaries. So unlike the national inventory, so that I think a lot of time all these the requirements are set of a boundary, but for cities it is a voluntary. So basically cities or states that they can set their boundary based on their needs and as well as the objective of the inventory. So we should start from setting the geographic boundary. So in many cases, it's the administrative boundary of the city or state concern. Then we should set the time period. So 1 year is the common practice, and sometimes it's or most of the time it is calendar year, but in some cases it can be a financial year that is a calendar year. Greenhouse gases. So it is in the GPC. So we ask to follow the Kyoto Protocol gases, but actually in many cases cities may choose the gases that are more applicable to them. In some cases, they focus on energy-related emissions. So carbon dioxide would be the main source. Then inclusion and categorization of emission sources. So this is important depending on the nature as well as the scope of the inventory and the objective. So cities may choose which emission sources to be included and not to be included. So this is so cities should think about this when setting the boundary. And finally is a categorization of emissions. So this is what we call categorization of emissions by scope. So if you're familiar with corporate greenhouse gas accounting, then you may remember, so there are 3 scopes of emissions. Basically, we try to capture the emissions from both production and consumption perspectives of emissions. So considering cities, so cities are not only producing emissions, but they are consumer or having a lot of human activities that produce emissions. Not all of them occurring in the cities itself, but outside the boundary. So considering this, so we divide the emissions into 3 scopes. Scope 1 covers all the emission sources within the city boundary. For example, emissions from industries, coal or fuel combustion in industry. So there's a direct emissions from the factory within the city. So that is a scope 1. Or transport within the city boundary. So that is scope 1. Scope 2 primarily come from electricity. So when the power plants are located outside the cities, then the emissions are also outside the city, but the consumption is taken in the city. So we think that is important to consider, considering, I mean, if we think about 1.5 or 2 degree global target, if we don't think about how we consume resources and energy, so it would be very difficult to manage the emissions. So we think when we measure emissions from cities, so we should consider emissions from electricity consumption as well. Then scope 3, so is covering other sources of transboundary or indirect emissions that occur outside the city boundaries, but the activities are taking place in city. So for example, a couple of them. So one, for example, is waste. We may produce waste in the city, but we do the treatment, whether it's incineration or landfill, that is outside the city boundary. So we think we should consider that as well. So, but considering the location is different from scope 1, so we categorize this as a scope 3. So it would be sort of a shared responsibility between the community producing the emission and community producing the waste. So this is basically the scope concept we have for cities.
We have one question there.
Yep. What is that? Under GP, so we have a question. So it says, under a basic GPC inventory, are cities required to report separately the waste from outside the city boundary treated inside the city boundary? So so you can choose to report separately. So in the template, the standard template we have, so it is under the same category. So but you may of course split them, indicate that it is producing from outside the boundary. So do you want to add anything, Alex?
Yeah, I would just say that the format allows for that to be reported separately if a city wants to have that kind of consideration where there are kind of a more consumption focused split between the waste that is managed locally versus waste that is generated locally.
Yeah, I think a very important point is that in the GPC or any other standards, so we only require the minimum standards or requirements. So you always have opportunity to provide additional information to demonstrate whatever message you want to convey. In this case, is waste produced from community outside the city. So I'm going to move forward. So next one is, I think I mentioned a couple times about the importance of connecting subnational actions to the national level, whether it's NDC or broader national policies. So in this sense, so when we created the GPC, so we have considered about this, that it should serve both the needs of the cities as well as the national government. So we need to ensure consistency between national inventories as well as subnational inventories, while highlighting the characteristics of cities. To do so, what we did was that we use basic categorizations of the IPCC guidelines for national greenhouse gas inventories. So as you can see, the blue boxes, so we have energy, IPPU, waste, AFOLU. So this is in the 2006 IPCC guidelines. So what we did was we slightly reorganized the categories. On the right is the sectors, the main sectors in the GPC. So what we did, you see, is like energy we split into two. So one is a stationary energy that covers like buildings, industries, and so on, and transportation. So we think like in cities, it's really important to highlight emissions from transportation, from buildings, to the first level of the. So rather than we just have broad category of energy. So we would like to highlight specifically how much transport from buildings, etc. So you can see, so there is consistency between subnational and national inventory, but at the same time we try to highlight some characteristics of subnational entities. So this slide addresses actually partly the question raised earlier about what do we mean by basic plus and expanded. So the basic idea we have for this is that when we consider subnational emission inventory, so if you remember, I mentioned earlier, so it's really essential to consider the capacity and the data needs of cities and subnational jurisdictions. So then we divide this the inventories into three categories. So basic category covers really the most basic needs of inventories at a city level. So that covers part of scope 1, scope 2, and part of scope 3. So you can see. So we expect almost all the cities would be able to develop these inventories, and these sources are applicable to almost all other cities. And the next one is a basic plus. So this is quite similar to the national inventory that covers basically everything, but the on top of the national inventories, so we do have from transboundary sources that covered under scope 2 and scope 3. So under scope 3, so you can see transportation, transboundary transportation is covered here. So this is a basic plus, so it's a more complete version of the inventory. Expanded, so this is currently not covered in the current GPC. So the idea is that eventually cities should develop a full value chain emission inventories that covers entirely scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. So in the current GPC, scope 3 is still not fully covered. So we just consider a few sources that are essential to most of the cities, but not on, for example, consumption of goods or services and so on are not covered here. So this would be in the future iteration of the GPC that may be coming up depending on demand from cities. Do you have a question?
Yeah, we've got several questions. So actually, maybe we'll pause here and try and address a few of them. So one was about how we deal with transboundary leakage, which I think is something that is somewhat resolved by the use of the scopes framework, which again splits scope 1 emissions by kind of a geographic frame, scope 2 into that grid supplied emissions, and then scope 3 as this kind of external out of boundary emission sources. And just a quick note on that, I think is that at their heart, a territorial-based kind of emissions accounting and a consumption-based emissions accounting are intrinsically not kind of harmonious and not compatible. If you're looking at the kind of accounting frameworks that we're approaching, the GPC and many other kind of accounting at this level are a hybrid approach between the two that have to necessarily make some trade-offs between what is covered between a consumption-based approach and a production-based approach. And so when there are questions of, if scope 3 emissions are not required to be reported at certain levels, how do we ensure that the measurement at that scope will be implemented? Well, scope 3, for instance, is a much more onerous and burdensome threshold for a lot of cities to meet and to make. And in terms of the the process that we undertook to come up with a GPC was kind of determined that this was the right level to pursue for the standard. So there are consumption-based accounting protocols that that do have what you might consider to be a full scope 3 accounting, which is a more of like a consumption-based footprint for the city, but that isn't necessarily compatible with both the data limitations that a lot of cities have and with the kind of hybrid approach of production and consumption that we're pursuing.
Yeah, so we considered about that as well, but as you remember, so I think one of the most important things we consider is the capacity of cities. So basically now it's a stage from 0 to 1, so it is very difficult for many cities. But having said so, I entirely agree with the question here that we do need to consider full scope 3 emissions. So that is something we're planning. So hopefully we can get into that soon when there is more demand for it. I think that, so there were also questions about data availability in sub-Sahara region, as well as constraint in terms of waste data. So I think this is data is not a common issue. It's not. I mean, not only in Africa. So data issue happens everywhere in the world, whether it's a developed or developing countries. So it's just, I think, the extent of issue or challenge is slightly different. So in terms of waste, so I think we just have to think about how to address the data issue. So it would be case by case, depending on capacity and access to data. So, and also GPC, we don't specify whether you should be using tier 1 methodology or tier 2 or tier 3. So you may use a more basic methodology if you really have a difficulty in securing data. And then the other initiative we have is something we call data portal project. So this could be applicable to the question on sub-Sahara region, that we are trying to work with a number of countries as our phase 1 project. Basically, the idea is to help cities access a database housed in the national government or state government. So in many cases, cities may not have access to those databases. So what we will do is to unpack this database for city level use, whether it's opening up the data or disaggregate the data to make them more easier to use at a smaller scale.
Yeah. I think before moving on, I think there's one more question I'd like to address here was, I'll read it out. If a city has assessed that they have some IPPU emissions, but they do not have significant AFOLU emissions to report, can they still say they're reporting a basic plus inventory, so that basic plus level? And the answer is yes, and that's kind of dealt with through the use of notation keys in the reporting itself, with just a basic explanation or justification for why there's no significant number in that category. But if they are meeting all of the kind of the requirements of that reporting level, certainly they can report at that level, and those exclusions could be made.
Yeah, I think just one more point to add here is that, so this is GPC requirements, but it also depends on whether which program you're joining. For example, if you're reporting to C40 cities, or if you're reporting to global communal mayors and so on, they may have additional requirements. So in some cases, for example, if you are reporting basic plus level, then all the sources of basic level should be included. So you should not have omit any one of them. So all this, so it depends on further program level requirements. should we move on? Or
Yeah, I think there's still a couple of questions we'll come back to, but we might tackle a couple of them as we progress through the rest of the slides, and then we'll revisit towards the end.
sure. So let's move on. Next thing is about the reporting framework. So this basically just to recap what we discussed just now. So there are two frameworks cities should report. So one is based on scope, and the other one is basic and basic plus. So I won't get into too much detail on this, which we have already discussed. So this slide shows the reporting templates presented in the GPC. So it may not be very clear on your screen, but is more importantly is to demonstrate actually how we should look at greenhouse gas inventories at the city level. So both from the perspective of scope as well as from basic and basic plus level. So there are multiple dimensions here. So it sounded more complicated, but it does provide more insights about how we should address the emissions. And I think one very important point to highlight here is that the GPC specifies reporting requirements, but it does not actually is to use any particular for reporting, including the template shown on the screen here. It's just recommended as long as you are reporting all the data points here. Actually, you're not necessarily using this format, so you may adjust to a format that is more suitable to your city or to the program. So as long as you fulfill all the requirements in the GPC. So any case, so today we wouldn't be able to dive into too much detail about the GPC. So please feel free to download the electronic version of the document from this website, www.ghgprotocol.org. So you can find actually all the GHG protocol standards and tools and guidance on this website. I'm going to move on, and then we do the Q&A. So I think we have just a few more slides. So I think we will address on the past couple slides about how to measure emissions, so which is the main subject of today's webinar. But I still would like to emphasize that the main purpose of measuring emissions is not only transparency, but eventually is to facilitate and subnational jurisdictions to take action. So this slide shows the interaction between subnational entities and the national government, or interaction between subnational and national actions. So on the right side, so you see the life cycle of action planning at the subnational level that we have been using for many years. So basically we start from measuring emissions, set an emission reduction target, plan for action, and implementation or demonstration. Then we track progress. So it is really a cycle, and over the years we're hoping cities or states would be able to enhance the ambition and to take more ambitious action. So it's important that we see how this process at the subnational level is integrated with the NDCs at the national level. So we discussed this about how we mainstream the NDC to the subnational level for implementation, as well as thinking about how to scale up or aggregate the subnational action to the national level. So this is one case study for the case of China. Maybe it's quite unique for the case of China, that the government system is quite a top-down type of a governance system. So in China, the national targets in the NDC is allocated all the provinces. So then each province is allocating the target to the cities in the province. So then on an annual basis, every year, all these provincial governments and the city governments, they are actually doing evaluation or appraisal to evaluate or assess the progress made by cities or provinces. So it's a very interesting appraisal system that they have. So it really shows this integration between different levels of actions in China, from cities to provinces to the national level. So I'm happy to talk through this more if you're interested. Then, so if we focus on the circle on the right, so then we remember, so there are 5 key steps: measuring emissions, setting target, planning for actions, implementing actions, and tracking progress. So at WRI, we have, or at GHG protocol, actually over the past many years, we have developed different tools, standards, guidance to support each of these steps. So today we are covering is on the top left-hand corner. So that is GPC that covers the very first step of the circle to measure emissions. And we do have another standard called mitigation goal standard that helps not only cities but also states or national government also can use the same standard to help to set their targets. So this would be covered in one of the upcoming webinars. Then planning for action. So this is another tools that we have developed a couple of years back in partnership with UN Habitat, that provides some guiding principles on how to do city level climate action planning. Then on the left hand side, then the final step is tracking performance. So this is more about how to track the GHG impact of a particular policy or particular action implemented. So we have a separate standard as well for this. And again, so we have a webinar, I think in the coming weeks to cover this topic as well. So the main message of this slide is that actually for each of these 5 important steps, there are a lot of tools and resources available to help you to take action. Then finally, I will present 2 very quick case studies on how cities walking through this cycle, this 5-step cycle. So I'll start from the city of Rio in Brazil. So I don't know whether any one of you from Brazil or from Rio. So I personally have been working with Rio for a few years, a couple years back. So in 2010, started in 2010, when we worked together with the World Bank to support Rio to develop its greenhouse gas inventory, so which was based on 2005 data. So that was the first step. So through in the same year, actually, then Rio committed to a target of a 20% emission reduction, then come up with an action plan. So then a series of actions were implemented in 2010 to 2012, especially many of those prior to a few key international events took place in Rio, including the last Olympic Games. So then through this process, actually over the past years, Rio have also undertaken these activities to track the progress, including updating the inventory in 2012 and towards the 20% target. Then this is another story in the city of Chengdu, China. So again, so personally, I was involved in this project. So we have been working with this city for the last couple of years, actually since 2012. So eventually, so in 2014, so we were able to support the city to develop its first ever greenhouse gas inventory. So that was using 2010 data. Then in the subsequent year, so we supported the city to commit to an emission peaking target, peaking by 2025. Then in the same year as well, we developed the action plan and roadmap towards the target. Then so similar to Rio, so we have been supporting the city to update the inventory, and currently we are supporting them to even update the action plan and roadmap to see possibility of more ambitious actions, as well as to evaluate the progress towards the 2025 peaking target. So I'll stop here. So that's all for me. So so we have about 10 more minutes to address some of your questions.
Fong, I think I'm going to start by reading some of the ones that have been posted a little bit
go
earlier.
ahead, yeah.
But maybe building off of your example in China, I think there was a question about some of the challenges mainstreaming MRV at the subnational level. I think maybe China has a pretty special case because there is a pretty strong top-down structure. But could you speak to maybe some of the challenges in general that people might have setting up a good MRV structure for subnational accounting?
Yeah, so I think so China has has a lot of experience in setting up this MRV system for different level of subnational level governments. But there is actually no requirements. So many of these are voluntary. So this may be different from understanding from many people outside the country. So so for the provincial level inventory, so that is sort of requirements, but again, I wouldn't say it's compulsory. And then at the city level is entirely a voluntary program. So actually, we many cities started a couple years back, so as same as other countries or cities. So they just use a different methodologies to measure the emissions. So without a standardized framework or methodology. But last year, the national government came out with a guideline for city level greenhouse gas inventory. So we can foresee in future this would become more and more standardized. So and the other thing is that I think I would like to highlight is that actually it is a very successful in China that it started with a program so-called National Low Carbon Cities pilot program. So started with a few provinces and cities, but over the years, over the past years, so through this several, I think like more than 10 of them, now already scale up to more than almost 100, and on top of this, about 100 pilot cities, there are many other voluntary programs or cities. So they have also adopted similar approaches to do their emissions inventories, and there is even a province set up a reporting program that all the cities and counties in the province are reporting their emissions on an annual basis. So it's so I could spend more time to talk about this, but with the time limitation, I'm just trying to cover just a bit of it.
There are a few questions too about additional resources for either more information or data sources or learning how to do some of this. And so I think in order to save a little bit of time, maybe we can just send out an email with a list of some of these to all the attendees just for your information, and also maybe information on some of the reports or guidance documents that were also covered in this in this slide.
Also, I just wanted to point out that the slide presentation for today's webinar is in the handout section. You should be able to find it.
Okay, but yeah, we'll have some additional resources that we can send out with that as well. I think there may be a question on some of the particulars of greenhouse gas accounting at the city level, and some GPC specific questions. And there's one about reporting emissions, or where to report emissions and allocate them when the electricity is produced outside of the boundary. I think that the Scope 2 emissions and Scope 1, the accounting of energy generation is probably one of the trickier ones to explain for some of the GPC and a lot of this accounting, because there is a Scope 1 element to the energy that is reported, or the energy that is generated from combustion within the city boundary. But when that energy is consumed via the grid, because it's hard to track exactly where the electrons are coming from once they hit the grid system, that all of that in the reporting framework, so in the reporting levels, are reported as Scope 2. But energy generated for the purpose of the grid within the city's boundary is reported as a Scope 1 item that is not tabulated in the rest of the inventory. And so that's kind of a particular case that's maybe a little bit unconventional or tricky for someone who's new to some of the accounting principles. There's another pretty good question here. I'm going to pass it to you, Fong. I think this is a good tricky one. But how do you think we could integrate public sector with corporate, academic, and communities? And I think this is in terms of accounting, and in terms of maybe data systems, and how to incorporate these together.
I'm not sure whether this refers to the government operation accounting. So if I understand it correctly, so before we published the GPC, so there were two types. Even now, there are two different types of practices in reporting city greenhouse gas inventories. So one is what we discussed today is really community-wide or city-wide emissions. The other one is to cover only the government or public sector emissions from public sector or city government operations, like schools, public buildings, public transportation, and so on. So that is entirely a different set of that is not covered in the GPC. But out there, you may be able to find related resources for that, which is quite similar to corporate level accounting.
So yeah, Gideon, sorry, he has a follow-up where he's saying he's interested in getting the community and the region as a whole to take a common approach and work together.
Okay, I see. So I think that there are different practices in different countries. So it can be voluntary program, or it can be initiated by the government as a requirement to ask all these different players to do their part. So if you are planning for a voluntary program, so there are a lot of similar initiatives, whether it's done by city networks like C40 cities, or like ICLEI or CDP and so on. So they do have this type of initiative. So you may, gather this type of players and encourage them to use this a standardized approach to report their emissions.
Okay, so we're almost out of time. If you have one last question, post it immediately. We had kind kind of just a little bit more about without any waste management system and any wastewater system, how can the greenhouse gases be measured? I guess that, what do you think about that?
So, yeah.
Yeah, if I'm interpreting the question correctly, maybe if there are no formal waste management systems, how can that specific sector be measured or accounted for? There are some default emission factors that we can borrow from the IPCC about certain types of informal waste disposal. But again, those are kind of an area where the uncertainty range is very, very high. And a lot of the recommendations that we tend to make keep going back to some of the basic accounting principles that are outlaid in a lot of the GHG protocol publications, where it's a consideration of relevance and completeness and consistency and what is most important for the inventory that's being put together. So in the case where there's not good data on waste, does it make sense to invest in time in improving the data that you do have, or is it fine to go with just a more general approach and just not spend as much effort on that particular sector?
Okay, and a final thought on reporting carbon sinks and captures. Many cities tend to report negative emissions. This participant thinks it's important to highlight this. Do you have any final thoughts on how GPC could?
Yeah, we do have this, so it's covered under this agriculture, forest, and other land use. So you may cover this carbon sink in your inventory.
All right. Well, thank you so much for participating and staying with us for the hour. We look forward to keeping up the relationship and looking, to have you participate in future webinars. We will try to. We have one last question: is what countries in Africa does WRI work with? Do we know?
Yeah, I think this at WRI we work with many countries, but under this specific project TASCA, so I think we work with Ethiopia,
right,
and South Africa, I think.
South Africa, yeah. But yeah, there are. We are actually expanding our country work and also having regional offices. I think one is opening up in Kenya, right?
You reach out to us by email, so we can address your questions.
So I will follow up by email with any of these specific questions in the chat. So thanks again, and look forward to. I will be sending you notices on future webinars and the recording as well, and also a list of resources that could be helpful. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.